Welcome to the Knowledgebase Ninjas podcast, where Gauri Ramkumar of Document 360 finds the best SaaS self-service knowledge bases in the world and then interviews their creators. Let's get started with today's episode.
Good day, everyone. Our guest today is Manasi Gandhi, technical writer at IBM. Welcome, Manasi, to the Knowledgebase Ninjas podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thank you, Gauri.
Fantastic. So, Manasi, please help me understand a little bit more about yourself, your writing skills in IBM. How did you initially got into documentation, please?
I work as a technical writer for IBM Cloud and Cognitive Software. The product I work for is the IBM WebSphere application server. I write documentation for features besides working on doc bugs, messages, and any other related documentation work. How I got into documentation, I always loved to write, and I wanted to formally get a degree in writing. So I researched for writing courses nearby, and I ended up meeting with the director of the Masters of Science in Technical Communication program at the NC State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. And after our conversation, I decided to enroll in the program, and I graduated in December 2019. That's how
Fantastic. That's great. That's great, Manasi. So, I know WebSphere personally as well. So it's really amazing to hear you're behind the documentation for such a great product. So what's your documentation process at IBM?
The documentation process is fairly mapped out pretty well. The first thing that I do is when I get a writing project, I research about the product that I'm writing or a feature that I'm writing on. This involves design thinking, understanding the user's perspective. After I have worked on the user's perspective, then I test the product if possible. After testing the product, I write my first draft. Now, this is a very initial draft. You cannot imagine how many edits it will go through until it publishes. But it's the first draft. And even while writing my first draft, I interact a lot with the SMEs, my peers, and so on. So once the first draft is ready, I send it to the SME for a technical review. Once it's technically reviewed, I send it to the content strategist for the strategist review. And later, after that, I send it to the peer. We peer review among our team. So I send it to one of my peers for a peer review. And after the peer review is done, I send it to the editor, our technical editor, for an editorial review. And after all these steps, once it's reviewed by the editor, it's ready for publishing. But all this while, I continuously work on my draft, make changes, edits, updates, and that helps me improve my writing process all the way. And then after it's ready for publishing, it's done.
Fantastic. So that's a detailed process you have there, Manasi. So can I just ask you how many years of experience you have as a technical writer?
As a technical writer, I would say I'm fairly new to this field. While I was at my college, I interned as a technical writer for our engineering college's knowledge base. And that's where I started my hands-on work as a technical writer while also doing my master's in technical communication at the same time. So I think I worked around 2 years there. And then I joined IBM as an intern in 2019, around May 2019. And I think after finishing my internship in January, I joined as a full-time IBMer. So I have a year's experience at IBM and a couple of years at my university. So it's 3 years, which is just the beginning, I think, but it's very interesting. I love my work.
Fantastic, great. What are the important factors you consider when creating documentation, Manasi?
The most important factors at IBM, I would say the internal standards we have are like clarity, conciseness, accuracy, accessibility, and so on. So that if those things are right, then your documentation will work. But besides that, as I mentioned earlier, understanding the user's perspective is the most important thing, because even if you write the best documentation, if your user doesn't understand it, I think you could do better.
Mm-hmm. Super. So now, after introducing such high quality documentation, have you seen any kind of reduction in your workload?
It definitely works if you write high quality documentation. You will get less inquiries or less customer calls to the service center, and that also reduces the cost of the organization, because if the documentation is done right, then the user can independently access the documentation and find the answers they need before they really pick up their phone and call the customer service. I think that helps a lot. So documentation is very important in that aspect.
Mm-hmm. True, very true. So the documentation that you write for your product, is that publicly available? There's no need for any logins?
Yes, it is publicly available. If you look up, or even if you make a Google search, you can access most of the documentation for the Knowledge Center of IBM. And I am not sure if any of the documentation is only available to the enterprise users. I need to look into it. But most of it is available publicly.
Oh, okay. So in that sense, does IBM currently generate any organic search traffic from your knowledge base?
The way we work is that we try to create quality documentation, and we believe that once you create quality documentation, which is clear, easy to understand, concise, and also accessible to the users, that will create organic search traffic. So those are the standards. We have very high standards for our documentation, and that's one of the strategies for generating organic search traffic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So I think we are almost close to the rapid fire round now. Manasi, would you like to add anything more before we move on to the rapid fire round questions?
No, all I want to say is documentation has really changed in the past few years from what I learned at my university. So the most important thing that I learned was the user perspective. And I think if you understand the user perspective, it goes a long way in making your documentation successful.
Very true. Super. So who have you learned the most about documentation from in your career?
I there is more than one person. I mean, there's a lot of people. I would begin with my professors at the university who helped me understand the perspective, a broader perspective of documentation. And I'm very thankful to them for that, to understand how documentation is important to the organization, and not only the organization, but a broader world in general, because we use technology in our everyday life. It's no more a privilege. It's a part of our everyday life. So we don't even know that we are using some products because they are just there. We just don't know. But it's important to understand the role technology plays in our everyday life, and how important the documentation for that technology is. So that's what I learned at my university. And a social perspective as well to documentation, like web accessibility, for example. It's important that your documentation is accessible to all kinds of users, not just, somebody who is a neurologically diverse person, or somebody who cannot access a product or a service visually, or somebody who needs help with, a help or additional tools to hear or the video or something. So all those things, like video should have captions, your your images should have the right documentation. So all those things are what I learned at the university. But after joining IBM, or even while working as an intern at my university, I learned hands-on documentation, which is different from what we learned at the university to an extent, because hands-on work is different. It's very, very detail-oriented. Every little detail makes a lot of difference, not just the grammatical one, but the technical details. You cannot make a mistake there, because that would change the meaning of what you are doing. So all those things I learned at my work from my team leads and peers. And I think it's just a beginning. It's a very long learning journey. And I think for technical writers, the learning journey never ends. So it's going to be there for a long time.
Super. So can you share a documentation related resource you have consumed recently? You told me learning is a process. So can you just share some of the contents that you just consumed recently?
I am reading this very interesting book currently. It's called The Strategic Writing for UX by Tori Podmar-Jersky. I think I am saying the name right. But that is helping me understand the user's perspective. And I would highly recommend that book to all technical writers. Though it's about it's about UX writing, but still it's very, very helpful for technical writers as well, to understand the pain points of the users and how words can have emotive effect on a user. And it's very beautiful. It's not a very big book. I mean, it wouldn't take a long time to finish it. So I would recommend that to many people.
Thank you so much, Manasi. So the last question is, what is that one piece of documentation related advice you would give to your 20-year-old self?
My 20-year-old self, I would say research more about the different writing professions. I think I wish I had known about technical writing in my 20s. I would have done my writing course then. But I'm still very happy that I did it now, and I found this wonderful profession, and I'm loving my work.
Super. Keep loving so you get the best, you give the best to the profession. Fantastic. So I think we are almost close to the Sorry, you might hear a slight background noise from the thunderstorm. So anything else you would like to add before we say bye to our audience?
So, I would say that as technical writers, we need to be more empathetic to our users, and any piece of documentation that we write, we need to be inclusive. As I mentioned earlier, the user's perspective, web accessibility standards, and also the terminology that we use, because that is something that we have to be more empathetic in the background of the current events happening, Black Lives Matter, and how we use the terms and what emotive effect it can have on the users. So it's very important to be empathetic as a technical writer, besides being technically accurate and clear and concise and detail-oriented.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for that tips, Manasi. So it was an absolute pleasure to have you as part of this podcast journey. So I hope you enjoyed the same.
Same here.
Super. So stay safe and take care of yourself and the family, and good luck for all your future projects, and take care.
Thanks, Gauri. Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Knowledgebase Ninjas podcast. Please head to iTunes, rate, and provide honest feedback on the podcast. See you next week.